is what really happened after marriage in 2026. Taehyung and Jungkook Part 2. Without any announcement. Without any warning, this moment quietly shook the global scene. Welcome to V Effect. They begged not once, not twice, but again and again. ARMY thought their voices would matter this time. They thought Taehyung and Jungkook would listen. But in 2026, everything changed. What was supposed to protect BTS instead shattered the fandom overnight. Timelines exploded. Trust cracked. Silence became louder than any statement. Fans weren't ready, and no one was ready, because this wasn't just a decision. It was a line crossed. And once Taehyung and Jungkook stepped over it, there was no turning back. The night the decision surfaced, there was no announcement, no press release, and no explanation. Just fragments, screenshots without context, deleted posts, and whispers moving faster than facts. By morning, ARMY already knew something irreversible had happened. Not because Taehyung and Jungkook said it out loud, but because the silence felt deliberate, calculated, final. This wasn't the kind of silence fans were used to. This one didn't comfort, it provoked. For years, every step they took had been weighed against loyalty, unity, and the unspoken promise that whatever happened next would be faced together. That promise was the reason fans stayed through enlistments, hiatuses, rumors, and storms that could have ended everything. Trust wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It held the entire world they built in place. And then 2026 arrived. What Taehyung and Jungkook chose to do wasn't reckless. That was the terrifying part. It was precise, thought through, clean enough to look reasonable on paper, yet sharp enough to cut straight through the fandom's core. Fans didn't panic because they didn't understand, it was worse. They understood too well. This decision didn't break rules. It rewrote them. Within hours, timelines split into two realities. One side tried to justify it, clinging to logic, maturity, and the right to personal choice. The other side felt abandoned, asking the question no one wanted to voice. If this was always the plan, what were we holding on to all this time? Taehyung stayed quiet. Jungkook stayed quieter. Every previous moment fans would have dissected for clues suddenly felt meaningless. Old interviews resurfaced. Lyrics were reinterpreted. Glances once thought comforting now looked like foreshadowing. It was as if the past itself had been edited without permission. And the most unsettling detail, they didn't look surprised. Those close enough to the situation noticed it immediately. This wasn't a last-minute call. This wasn't pressure. This was a choice made long before fans ever sensed danger. That realization hit harder than any rumor ever could. ARMY didn't feel angry at first. They felt foolish. Because begging only happens when you believe your voice still matters. And when that belief collapses, it doesn't explode. It sinks quietly, heavily, leaving behind a question no one could answer yet. Was this the beginning of freedom or the beginning of separation disguised as growth? No statement came that day, and no clarification followed the next. Only the feeling that something sacred had shifted, and whatever was coming next would demand a price no one was ready to pay. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Not because anything new was said, but because nothing was corrected. In a world where clarity could have calmed everything, ambiguity was allowed to breathe, and it grew teeth. Fans waited for a sign, a single sentence, even a familiar gesture. But what arrived instead was distance, subtle, intentional, impossible to misread. Schedules moved without explanation. Appearances felt rearranged. Names that were once inseparable began to appear alone. It wasn't dramatic on the surface. That was the cruelty of it. Nothing collapsed loudly. Everything loosened quietly. The fandom started noticing patterns no one wanted to acknowledge. Taehyung's tone shifted, still warm but guarded, as if every word now had a cost. Jungkook, once open to the point of vulnerability, retreated into precision. His presence felt controlled, almost rehearsed, like someone protecting a decision he knew would be judged. Speculation didn't ignite overnight. It seeped in slowly, relentlessly. Some fans defended them with exhaustion in their voices, repeating that growth requires discomfort. Others asked why growth suddenly demanded separation. Why something that once thrived on unity now seemed to avoid it. And beneath those arguments lived a deeper fear no one wanted to type out loud. What if this wasn't temporary? Because temporary things reassure people. They promise a return. This felt different. This felt like a door closed gently so no one could say it was slammed. Old bonds were suddenly treated like memories instead of foundations. And memories, no matter how beautiful, don't hold weight in the present. That realization hurt more than any confirmation ever could. Behind the scenes, those closest to the orbit noticed how carefully everything was being handled. No accidental overlap. Every move suggested alignment, not chaos, which only deepened the unease. Disorder could have been forgiven, strategy could not. Army didn't feel betrayed by the choice itself. They felt erased from it. For the first time, fans weren't part of the conversation, not even as witnesses. They were left watching the aftermath of a decision already sealed, wondering when they had stopped being included in the future they were promised. And yet the most unsettling part remained unsaid. Neither Taehyung nor Jungkook tried to soften the impact. No familiar trust us moments. Just progression forward, away from the noise, away from expectations. It begged the question, had they already accepted the cost? And if that was true, then the question was no longer what did they choose, but what were they willing to lose to protect it? By the third week, the shock had hardened into something heavier. Not outrage but resignation, the kind that settles in when people realize waiting won't change the outcome. The conversation shifted from why to what now. And that shift alone confirmed how deep the fracture had become. Every move Taehyung and Jungkook made was now measured against absence. Not what they did but who wasn't there. Moments that would have once felt ordinary. An appearance, a performance, a quiet update, now carried a hollow edge, as if a shadow had been edited out of the frame. Fans stopped asking for explanations and started searching for patterns. The smallest details became evidence. The timing of releases, the phrasing of messages, even pauses, those brief, calculated silences were treated like confessions. Nothing was accidental anymore. Everything felt curated to avoid collision, and that was when the narrative became dangerous. Because distance, when left unexplained, invites imagination. Some began to frame the decision as liberation, applauding the courage to step outside what once defined them. Others saw it as a strategic retreat, a slow dismantling of something too powerful to end abruptly. Both sides agreed on one thing. This was intentional. Taehyung's presence grew more introspective. His words leaned towards solitude, towards self-definition, toward boundaries that had never been spoken so clearly before. Jungkook, on the other hand, appeared sharper, more controlled, almost defiant in his consistency, as if proving that stability could exist without togetherness. The contrast unsettled people. They weren't moving in opposite directions, they were moving parallel. And parallels, by definition, never meet. That realization rippled through the fandom like a quiet aftershock. Because if this wasn't conflict, if this wasn't fallout, then it was a choice, mutual, understood, irreversible. Army felt the weight of that truth slowly pressing down. Not because they didn't support growth, but because growth was now happening somewhere they couldn't follow. The emotional distance widened, not through rejection, but through independence. And independence, when it comes without warning, feels like abandonment. The past was no longer something to return to. It had become a reference point. A chapter closed not with a final sentence but with an ellipsis that refused to promise anything. As the weeks passed, the chaos didn't escalate. It stabilized. And that stability was the most frightening part of all. Because chaos implies correction. Stability implies acceptance. And once acceptance takes hold, there's no going back. Only forward into a future that no longer asks for permission. Acceptance didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through routine, through fans waking up and realizing they no longer checked for joint updates first, through the quiet adjustment of expectations, and through learning slowly and unwillingly how to enjoy moments without waiting for something or someone else to appear. That was when the loss became real. Not dramatic, not loud, just permanent. Taehyung's world began to feel smaller, more deliberate. His choices reflected introspection rather than reassurance. Every appearance carried a sense of distance, as if he was standing slightly apart from the version of himself fans thought they knew. Not colder, just untethered, free in a way that made people uncomfortable. Because freedom implied he no longer needed the same anchors. Jungkook, meanwhile, seemed to harden around his decision. There was confidence there, but also resolve. The kind that only forms after something precious has already been weighed and set aside. He didn't look lost. He looked prepared. And that preparation told a story fans weren't ready to hear. They had already grieved, not publicly, not emotionally, but privately, before anyone else realized there was something to mourn. That truth stung more than any imagined conflict, because it meant the pain fans were experiencing now was delayed. It meant Taehyung and Jungkook had crossed this emotional threshold long ago. Alone, without the crowd that once promised to walk every step with them. The fandom tried to name what was happening. Transition, evolution, rebirth. None of the words fit. They sounded too hopeful, too clean. This wasn't transformation. It was subtraction. Something essential had been removed, and no amount of new meaning could fully replace it. What unsettled ARMY most wasn't separation. It was the calm. No cryptic messages, no emotional cracks, no signs of hesitation. Calm suggested certainty, and certainty suggested finality. Some fans began to wonder if this was the plan all along, to let time do the work words never could, to allow distance to normalize what an explanation might only inflame. So it was effective. Pain dulled. Noise faded. And in that quiet, the truth became unavoidable. They were no longer moving toward the same future. Not because something broke, but because something changed. And change, when embraced fully, doesn't ask for forgiveness. As the chapter closed, one question lingered, heavier than before. Not spoken, but felt by everyone watching from the outside. If this was only the beginning, what would the ending demand? The first real confirmation didn't come as a statement. It came as an omission, an event where both names were expected, but only one appeared. No explanation followed, no apology. The absence was treated as neutral, almost mundane. And that neutrality sent a sharper message than any denial ever could. Fans noticed immediately. They always did. What once would have been brushed off as scheduling now felt symbolic. The space left behind was too deliberate, too clean. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice being exercised in public for the first time. Taehyung stood alone, composed, unbothered on the surface. He spoke carefully, choosing words that felt inward-facing rather than inclusive. Jungkook elsewhere mirrored that same restraint, present, focused, moving forward as if the missing half of the picture had never been part of the frame. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. This wasn't distance born from tension. This was coordination without convergence. ARMY didn't panic. Panic had passed. What replaced it was something colder, analysis. Fans began to understand that this wasn't about drifting apart. It was about redefining proximity, about choosing when closeness existed and when it didn't. And that control was new. For years, togetherness had been instinctive, almost automatic. Now, it appeared intentional only when necessary and absent by design. That shift rewired everything people thought they knew about loyalty and about promises that were never spoken but always assumed. Some fans tried to convince themselves this was a phase, that cycles repeat, that history guarantees reunion. But history only comforts those who believe the present is temporary. This didn't feel temporary. It felt managed. Behind the scenes, sources spoke in fragments. Nothing concrete, nothing bold enough to quote, but the tone was consistent. Calm, resolved, already moved on. Whatever internal discussions had happened were no longer ongoing. Decisions weren't being debated. They were being executed. That realization landed quietly and then stayed. ARMY began to ask a harder question, one they had avoided since the beginning. What if this wasn't about separation at all? What if it was about preservation? Because sometimes people don't step away from what they love because it failed, but because it became too powerful to survive unchanged. Sometimes distance isn't rejection, it's containment. And that possibility frightened fans more than any breakup narrative ever could, because containment suggests intention, and intention suggests permanence. As the weeks stretched on, the chaos didn't return. No explosions, no confrontations, just a steady unfolding of a future that looked increasingly singular, increasingly defined by choice rather than history. And in that unfolding, one truth became impossible to deny. Whatever Taehyung and Jungkook were protecting, they had already decided it was worth everything else. By the time the narrative settled, it no longer needed fuel. It sustained itself on inevitability. Fans began to notice how rarely the past was referenced anymore. Not erased, but carefully placed behind glass. Celebrated, acknowledged, yet untouched. like something too fragile to bring back into the present without breaking it. That restraint spoke louder than nostalgia ever could.